Welcome, everyone. This is our first YouTube conversation stream as Credible Security. By way of introductions to us as an organization, we are a cybersecurity advisory firm made up of the three of us, Josh, Kim, and Jess. And today we are excited to host Melanie from Discernible as we go through a conversation about the myth of shared responsibility in security. Melanie, over to you.
Sure. Great, Josh. Thanks so much. So I want to start with just setting some baseline understanding of what the myth of shared responsibility is, right? I think all of us have kind of heard that mantra from time to time in the InfoSec space of, security is everybody's responsibility. It's not everybody's responsibility. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a security team. But I think it's coming from a good place. It's well-intentioned, right? It's essentially, I think, coming from the desire of wanting more people throughout the organization to know the decisions they can make, the steps that they can take to at least contribute to a more secure organization, right? At the very least, to just not make things worse, right? So I do think it's coming from a good place, but it strikes me as an interesting. Whenever I hear it, it strikes me as interesting because I never hear like HR or finance or sales. Like sales doesn't say that sales is everybody's responsibility. In fact, most salespeople I've worked with, if I try to do sales, will have some things to say about it, right? So. I think really what security teams are trying to get behind is how do we influence and how do we persuade the behavior that's happening within our organizations. And so, Jess, I want to start with you because you've been the right-hand person for a CISO before, right? You've been CISO chief of staff. And so I'm curious from your perspective, what are some of the things that you have done to actually embed security into the DNA of the organization, things beyond, I think, the typical awareness training that a lot of orgs have to do for compliance. So I'm curious if you can share some examples on things that you have done. And as you walk us through, the past experience that you've had on this issue, I'm wondering if you could also touch on whether or not there are specific roles within the organization, whether they're existing roles or roles that you developed for the organization to help fuel and catalyze all of this to happen beyond the reporting chains of the security organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Melanie. I think having experienced this while building teams, security organizations at companies like Duo and Cisco and Tessian, alongside Josh and Kim. One of the things that I have felt most connected to in those experiences is finding ways to make security authentically part of the culture and the DNA of the organization. And as security practitioners, I think we have a lot of really special opportunities to do that authentically. And I think I also think that if we're not doing that authentically, our employees and our peers can feel that too, right? So some of the ways that I think we've been successful in being able to do this is being really explicit from day one internally in our team of how we want to show up to the organization. So we have gone so far as to create a team charter in every team we've built that is really explicit about, what is our obligation to the company from a security perspective, but also how do we want to show up every day to work? And we as a team hold each other very accountable for that. So things like, no heroics, and when you take PTO, we expect you to be offline. And those don't seem naturally like connected to security, but they're actually really integral in building trust within your team. And then I think by establishing that in your security organization, the rest of your company feels that in the way that you're showing up to work with them. And so they feel that, you're transparent and you're willing to say like, hey, we're the security organization. Here's how we show up for you. And here's what you can expect from us. And being really, really explicit with the way that you craft that language and share with the rest of the organization. I think also, in terms of weaving in security to the DNA of the entire organization, it really is about finding ways to infuse security into places where the rest of your peers are already at. So, for example, in our duo days, we had duo lunch talks, and every talk was kicked off by the founders talking about, hey, here's what's going on in the industry that's important for us to be aware of from a security perspective. Also, like finding authentic ways to fit into written communications in the organization. So at Tessian, we had a really large group of teammates in London. So we wrote the security, just honoring the tea lover, the tea love for many in our org, and we shared news that way that was authentic to the rest of the organization's culture too. So chief of staffs are definitely a vehicle to help kind of make like be a catalyst for this type of alignment and connection to other behaviors that are already in your organization. I'd also say that internal communication partners are definitely someone that I have leaned on and worked really closely with in the past to put perspectives together to say, hey, how would this resonate with other groups in the org, to share more about what we're doing and to help our peers and teammates across the company feel connected to security and what our mission is. So.
Yeah, I think I will just say, having worked with all three of you, I think one of the things that you and Josh did really well as CISO and Chief of Staff was Josh had a very clear vision for the security organization. And he didn't just deputize you, he empowered you to execute that. And it was very clear to everybody on the team that if you were on the call, it was the same as if Josh was on the call. And so I think the way that the two of you really partnered closely together, and the fact that you were very deliberate with that team charter. It wasn't just a mission statement and a list of values that lived somewhere on the intranet, but nobody knew what to do with. It was an integral part of how you made decisions as a team. And leaders within the organization were expected to show how their decisions and how their priorities were an embodiment of that team charter. Because there's a million things a security team could be doing, but in order to have really strong priorities and to be disciplined, you can actually make progress on anything. Being able to hold yourself to that team charter, I think, was something that your organization did really well.
Thanks. It really set that North Star, I think, for there to be no questions from anyone in our team or leaders throughout the organization. Everyone knew where we were going and how we were going to get there.
Yeah, which did actually make it easier for your organization to partner with the business, right? And with your cross-functional colleagues, because you had a really strong sense of self, if that makes sense, right? From an organization perspective. Kim, I want to hop over and to you for a minute and ask you some questions, because you are a resident trust expert. And want to get your perspective on how do you bridge the gap between the actual security requirements that a security team may have, right? Once they've done their assessment and they've prioritized, here are the issues that we want to address first and foremost. How do you bridge the gap between here's the requirements and the desired outcomes from the security team, and then the actual business initiatives that are driving other departments?
Yeah, so interestingly, Jess already set the foundation where the beginning is actually that trust relationship. The beginning is actually recognizing that both of you understand each other's needs and what your job actually entails. I think one of the things that Jess maybe undersold is how much time she actually took with folks to understand where their questions might have been, and then to do that translation work of what the team charter meant for their specific role. But that's actually where you would start for this bridging of the gap. Once you kind of actually align on what those outcomes are and how they relate to each team's specific function, And that takes a lot of curiosity and a lot of questions. That's when you start translation work. Like the next thing that I always think about is translating. I call it jargon just because I'm not a super fan of very specific language that only one single unique team can use that all other teams find completely obtuse. Um, but when you can translate one team's mode of speaking to another team's mode of speaking so that you both know you're talking about the same thing, you're using the same words, that's when you can actually get to the part of the bridge being built for that gap. Um, the trust building relationships make that the only way that you can know you're going in the same direction. If a security team has a certain requirement, the engineering team, for example, needs to actually trust that the security team has the expertise to provide what the most important thing, the highest priority, actually is. I have definitely seen teams not have that trust, and then you end up in weird arguments where different teams are trying to tell the security team what their priorities ought to be for security. Maybe the security team is telling the engineering team what the engineering team's priorities ought to be, but those should never actually be arguments. It should actually be discussions that are egoless about where these priorities actually fall. And again, that comes back to that curiosity and team building. And those curiosity questions will let you know, okay, maybe my priority is the highest priority for security, but really in engineering, it's definitely not actually the highest priority, and it shouldn't be because it's going to get in the way of, a product release or some other business objective. But recognizing that as the security team is okay. It doesn't make you lesser or anything like that. But then other times, it really will matter for the security team to be representing what they're doing as the highest priority and to say, hey, we actually have the C-suite's buy-in for this. We have, like, the board is asking about it. We have to get this done. And representing that both gently, but also, I'm going to say firmly, is really important. But that comes back to the trust, because if you can represent that position firmly, the engineering team won't necessarily hear that as scolding. They won't hear that as trying to tell them what to do or reducing their own importance in the org. They'll actually hear it as, no, really, we know what we're doing. Both of us are experts here, and so equally competent. We just have different roles.
Yeah, and I think that one of the most important underpinnings from like a skill development perspective that we're talking about here is communication. And that's one of the things I want to highlight in terms of like why we've partnered between our organizations is that my team previously, when we were not Credible Security, but working for a much larger enterprise company, we actually partnered with Melanie and Discernible to actually level up how we actually approach the communication, not just tactics, but strategies around trust building, as Kim, you were saying, and then just like, in trying to identify and level up our relationships proactively with the stakeholders that we have across the organization. It was taking the time to mindfully invest and build towards those capabilities that really, I think, made us successful in the long run. And I think that hopefully that we're getting a taste of what that looks like here as well today as we have this discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I wanted to note, as Kim was talking about, there's a lot of interaction between individual team members, right, on the security side and in product and engineering and oftentimes in marketing, because they cause the most shadow IT issues, right? So there is a lot of one-on-one interaction or small group interaction that just falls outside of a traditional like security awareness workshop, right? And I think, to your credit, Josh, that was one of the things that your team did really well. And I think it starts at the leadership level as the CISO to say, first and foremost, my responsibility is to earn political capital for my organization so that we can get the resources and the trusted relationships that we need to be successful and to fulfill our obligation to the organization, right? And so I know that you had dedicated strategy program in terms of relationships at your peer level. But then the reason you brought in Discernible was because you had the understanding that the strategy and the charter was great, but not sufficient if individual team members didn't have the communication skills to negotiate for and live and prioritize the values and objectives that charter set out, right? And so I do see a lot of teams that they think they have the strategy piece done, but that doesn't mean that every single individual person in the security organization understands how to go into a product review meeting and be effective in that space in getting security into a product roadmap, right? And so I look at it as kind of two parallel tracks. Is at the senior most level, the CISO needs to be doing everything they can to become a trusted relationship with their peers and other leaders in the organization, right? Because I've also worked with CISOs who are not respected by their peers, and that is felt by their entire team, right? And then and then filtering through the entire organization, there also has to be a dedicated effort to make sure that we're up-leveling the communication skills at every level so that every IC, every engineer, every program manager can go into whatever space they're responsible for managing or where they're representing the security priorities to be able to effectively communicate that. Because it's not always that you're going to get security into an engineering performance ladder. I wish that was always possible. It's certainly a long-term goal that we always strive for, but again, a lot of it also depends on the CISO's relationship with head of engineering. And so there's not always something that the rest of the team can control. But then also looking for where are the places where you do have influence, even as an IC, right? Are you the lead on a project, even just for the day, where you can use that opportunity to exert influence in a way that is not only effective for security, but to Kim's point, is also building trust and creating these interpersonal relationships where, I mean, if something is not being forced on me by my, my desire for a promotion or by my boss, like the thing that gets us to do stuff that we don't have to do or that we don't want to do is the relationships we have with the people that we work with, right? And so I think a lot of times this idea of shared responsibility falls flat as if we just do enough videos or enough hackathons like this, we'll just like diffuse throughout the organization, where the most powerful influence we have as a security organization is the one-on-one connections we have with the people that we work with, the moments where it really matters, where we can call on a favor or, ask for help. And even if it's not in, the KPIs for engineering that quarter,
Yeah, I think,
go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, one of the things I just noticed when you said calling in those favors and stuff, what I think's so important is to recognize how that stuff stacks over time, where you can't go in and be like, I'm going to call in a favor today to this person I've never met. You have to be having those relationship conversations and showing good faith effort before then, and an understanding of the importance of that person's role. I mean, I honestly, one of the things that was most effective when you mentioned just what can you do as an IC, very early on in my career when I had no political capital, no organizational power, nothing, I just literally would chat with people. Like I'd ask them about their job because frankly, I was like, how does this fit into this over here? I don't understand. And I just wanted to know how the organization worked. But what I quickly found was that curiosity about how the organization fits together and how the leadership perceives what they've built mattered in the future for those trusted relationships. And I was able to call in favors that I didn't even know I had collected. And I think that genuine, authentic curiosity like shines through when you're trying to make these relationships. And like, I really did care what other folks were doing in their positions because I just wanted to know. But that made them excited to remember why they have their jobs. That made them excited to tell me about where they felt they fit in. And that made my team interested in knowing what I was learning from other teams. And that network effect really compounds over time. And so I think also something to just remember is when folks are thinking about, well, I don't know who I can call in favors for, don't think about it as like a next week thing. Like you're investing, time into these relationships for a year out, a quarter out, maybe even multiple years later when you're all moving through this industry as peers.
Yeah, and I think having that strong strategy as an organization means that every IC can look at those objectives and say, if I had to do these things tomorrow, what teams would I need? Like which friends would I need to have? Like we have this saying in communications that you have to have a friend in order to use a friend. So it is a long-term investment. And it's easier to identify which relationships you could potentially need if you have a really clear sense of what the roadmap is, right? And where the end goal is. So Josh, I want to ask you a question, and Jess, I'm just kind of going to put you in the batter circle because I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are on this as well. But Josh, having been a CISO, can you talk us through some of the specific strategies that you have implemented in order to create meaningful accountability for security across the organization, right? So, you know, I'm sitting here like, you know, stabbing the myth of shared responsibility in the back, but I want to hear from you, like, what are some of the things that folks can do at the leadership level that will actually make that accountability outside of your organization actually mean something? And how do we get to shared responsibility in the way that it's actually true?
Yeah, I think that, like, as we started with the intent of the vision that people tend to have for shared accountability, it's all positive. However, the impact is the big question, right? How do we actually successfully achieve this in a way that is actually effective and doesn't also have some negative, unintended negative downsides to saying it's a shared responsibility? So what I try to focus on is really two, maybe three things. The first is, and this goes back to the need for effective communication and relationship building, right? So my job as CISO was to build the relationships with the appropriate and necessary parties, figure out how to actually engage with the right stakeholders to not ask for favors up front, but to build the relationship, understand they're part of the business, understand what matters to them, what are they accountable for already in terms of tactical ongoing requirements and outcomes, but also strategic, thinking about annual planning and year-long budget planning and so on. And then my job was to figure out how to bridge what we needed as a security organization to advocate for and achieve to those additional stakeholder parties. And we always say that, like, you know, security leadership roles is all about translation. It kind of is, but it's also really about having empathy for the broader business functions that you need to support, and then figuring out where and how you fit in. Yes, you have to communicate the rest of that effectively, but it's really getting that global alignment of what problems are we trying to solve, what are we trying to achieve in terms of outcomes as a business. And then as we're working with a go-to-market team, what are they accountable for this quarter, this year, and so on? And then where do we weave ourselves in there? That also tactically helps with some of that relationship building, because it's easier to build those empathy bridges between individuals and teams when you understand, hey, our SecOps team is in a highly operational role. They have pager duty or something equivalent, and you know, they could be woken up in the middle of the night. Well, it turns out a lot of sales is like that too, as well, and customer success and customer support as well. And so I think it's figuring out the places in the business where you have these more organic functional overlaps and experiences, and then using those more tactically as bridge building, functions as well. Yeah, and I think that once you're able to actually get the lay of the land there, cascade some of that relationship development, it just becomes so much easier to have this interweaving between global exec and board level outcomes that we advocate for and care about and are accountable for as a security team, but then also layer by layer from the exec team down to the newly hired frontline IC, actually layer in objectives and requirements and targets that we're all shooting for together, and figure out how to actually distribute that accountability for those shared outcomes more effectively.
Yeah, and I think one thing that comes to mind in that particular kind of setup, Josh, is that as you're weaving yourself into the business discussion, right, thinking of how can security actually help our partners accomplish the goals that they have, it's also really important that they know that that's what we're doing, right? That I'm not just like silently helping you. I want you to know that I'm dedicated and committed to helping you succeed. And I think that's often something that's missed in the traditional language of shared responsibility. Of I'm not trying to force anybody to do anything else, and I'm not pushing something on people. I'm looking at where they're trying to go, and then communicating with them to say, I want you to get there too. right? Here's my skill. Here's what I can control. Here's my tool set. Here's what I can do so that you can get to where you're trying to go, right? Whether that means getting there safely, getting there faster, getting there with fewer bumps, right? Like every bump in the road is a cost somewhere, right? Even if it's just, a distraction from a mission critical project, right? And so, Jess, I told you that I was going to be coming to you, so this is the moment. And I'm curious from your perspective, having done, this kind of execution with Josh, you and I, and in this group actually, in the past, we've talked a bit about what is, popularly termed like glue rolls. We've also talked about why we don't like that term because we think they're actually like catalysts, not just like connectors, right? But when you think about the organization, how do you think about those types of roles in terms of the skill set that they need beyond just project management, as you're building those relationships for the security organization across departments?
Yeah, I think that these type of roles, and there are probably hundreds of titles, but when I am sort of thinking about them, it's the project managers, program managers, technical program managers, and all of those mean different things. Chief of staff, they all mean different things at different organizations, but in general, they are the team members that have a broader viewpoint than our individuals do, and sometimes even our managers managing their team and their charter do. And so they are enablers and catalysts for really incredible progress because they're positioned in a way that helps drive alignment across a broader part of the organization. And so some of the best outcomes I think we have shared as a team is when we do have great partners in engineering. So I've worked with chiefs of staff that are dedicated just to engineering orgs. We've worked with a ton of really amazing project managers for engineering that manage Scrum, but they also are empowered to think strategically for the teams that they support. And so they also often do work that's really hard to quantify, how the time and the energy. And sometimes I even fall into this trap where I'm like, what do I even do? And Kim's like, no, you have these skills. And like, this is why, your contributions enable us to do these other important things. And so one of the greatest superpowers, I think, for these roles is having the ability to see multiple viewpoints. So often when we come together as a team and we're looking at solving a problem, I will really take the time to say, okay, this is what it means for our team, but how does this affect someone that I've already built a relationship with in finance? How does it affect our team's really key partners and people, and all around from go-to-market to product to customer service? And I think there's value in having individuals in these roles that can really build those relationships to better understand those perspectives, because you don't necessarily want all of your management team to have to do that. But that's why investing in a role like chief of staff is so valuable, because the right person in that role will bring those perspectives to the table and help challenge the way that your management and your ICs think about problems and their approach to solving them.
Yeah. So one of the things that came up for me as you were talking was actually matching to Josh's idea about those affinities and strengths between team members, because the quote unquote glue work people that we're talking about, program managers, chief of staff, they're close enough to those individual team members to know them deeply, to even know about roles that they've had perhaps in a previous position, or perhaps just interests that they have. And those unique individual, like an individual's personal past, current relationships, current interests, hobbies, even that stuff is literally how you find those affinities across teams to create that natural bridge, those natural relationships, and the natural curiosity that is so authentic that it actually leads to the bridging of the gap that we're all after. And it actually just occurred to me also when we talk about this shared responsibility for security, like it's really the glue team members that understand how it's not that they have the shared responsibility of each of these specific orgs, but they understand how it all fits together. And so if anyone can understand how everyone holds different parts of this shared responsibility, that I see it as pillars. It's like everyone's got their own little pillar to hold up the roof. That doesn't mean you can go and take someone else's pillar because the roof will fall down. But those glue work people are the ones who actually understand where all the pillars are located and understand what load bearing they're doing and how it's working.
Yeah, really that reminds me that I was just going to say that those individuals are, at least from my perspective, when we go in and do our various like diagnostics and assessments on the like anthropomorphic side, as we're trying to figure out where is the root of these communication and relationship challenges, those people are an extremely valuable source of information because they understand, whether consciously or not, the relationships that are happening. Like you've said, Kim, they know the context and the history, and they're a really, really good early warning sign for when things are going off track, right? So they are, I've worked with so many CISOs who want to say things like, I have an open door policy, and like, I'm sorry, the power dynamics are just not built for everybody to feel so comfortable going to the CISO with every issue, right? But the people who sit in between all of the different organizations, and quite frankly, whose job it is to figure out how to get to a shared outcome, right? They're often better at it than the people that are in the teams that they're working with. But it also means that they're a great resource for leadership, and like talk to them often about how things are going on the team, because that is a great way to get unofficial feedback about issues that you otherwise wouldn't know are about to explode. Yeah. Josh, did you want to add something?
Yeah, everything that we just talked about, I think for some audiences, I'm thinking about myself, earlier in career as well, like, kind of like intuitively knowing the value of, prioritizing and investing in this type of relationship development, the communication skills that we discussed and all of that. But it's sometimes hard to connect the dots between that and like, okay, what do you get in return on investment for that? And one thing like I love calling out for peers is like, it's good planning outcomes. So when you're going into planning cycles, budget cycles in particular, whether it's like strategic and it's like a 12-month cycle, or it's more tactical, especially on the planning side, and you're trying to figure out what are we doing next sprint, what are we doing next month, next quarter, and so on. This is where all this glue really holds something cool together, if you get the investment right. So being able to take that strategic approach and that I mentioned earlier, and just being able to like layer it down, these glue roles and these relationships are what really hold that structure together. And if you're able to get this right, those processes become not just more efficient, which everybody loves, of course, but they actually become more effective as well, because you have more folks who better understand each other's outcomes and areas of accountability, getting to a point where this shared responsibility really becomes distributed accountability that everyone is aligned on, or at least aware. I mean, there's always going to be some tension on some things in terms of prioritization, but at least there's an awareness and an understanding of why it matters, who does it matter for, and how do we actually approach a conversation around budgets, around milestones and KPI measurements and so on. So worth every single bit of energy you can put into it, in terms of an upfront investment in order to get to that return.
So Josh, I know that we're very lucky that now you're sharing all of your like hard-earned wisdom with us, but I'm wondering if previously in your career, I mean, have things ever like, do you have any failure stories of, where you tried to do a shared responsibility strategy, maybe not the way that you would have done it today? Like, I'm curious because I'm sure you did things that other people are doing. And so if you have any like failures or things that haven't worked, I think that would be also valuable to hear.
I wish we had time for 10% of them. I think we have time for maybe like a couple of examples. But no, I mean, yes, I have more than my fair share, I think. And it's a consequence of like being more willing to try things out, which I would recommend to folks, but just know that you are going to fail, many times before you find what works. So some quick examples. I've supported messaging in organizations where the theme was that security is always the most important priority in that organization. And that was from like a leadership level all the way down. And while it wasn't my idea initially, I certainly became a champion for it. And one of the things that I learned by running face first into this wall was that if everything is the most important priority, then nothing is. Meaning that it then became very difficult for members of that organization to differentiate between a actual like P0 security issue and something that is a security thing, but actually is not all that important, and you do not need to call anyone at 2 o'clock in the morning about. So if you think about like the downside to that, it's pretty tremendous, even though it sounds really great. Another brief example is something as commonplace as dealing with vulnerability management, right? So I was at a very large enterprise organization where I held accountability on the security side for corporate vulnerability response for the enterprise. And my team would partner with our client platform engineering team, so the folks in IT who managed all the laptops and workstations for employees to use. And we would sit down every Patch Tuesday from Microsoft and go over, the vulnerabilities and the patches, and figure out a patch cadence for the Windows portion of our fleet. Because we did not invest enough in defining, or even exploring what are we being held accountable for as teams, and then how do we make sure that even if it's not fully like shared, we're understanding how security pushing for a overnight update of a very large fleet may impact negatively what the IT team is being held accountable for. We never really had that conversation proactively. We only had it reactively, which meant that over the course of a year plus of really like going through these cycles, every single time felt like we were starting from scratch. And we never were able to actually build the muscle memory that we needed in order to be able to become more efficient. And so I would say like that's a pretty classic failure condition that I think a lot of people in security have felt directly. But yeah, there's definitely like, plenty of those stories out there. But I think the really important thing is like to really stop and say, great, we know that we're going to fail as security teams. Every team has failures when you're trying to figure these things out. None of what we've talked about in terms of like the relationship building, the organizational alignment, all of that like works perfectly the first try. So the real question for security programs and especially leadership is, how are you actually approaching setting yourself and your team, more importantly, up to feel confident in trying these things while still being able to identify and respond to failure when it hits you in the face?
Yeah, there's two things that come to mind. I want to combine something that you said with something that Kim was saying. You were talking when you were like, for example, when you were talking about like the Patch Tuesday scenario, thinking about how is that going to impact everybody using those machines, right? Like it's very difficult to build a trusted relationship when you're constantly giving your colleagues whiplash, right? When you are the cause of their disruption, when you are the one causing delays. And so it's like there are going to be times where the security team really does need to break glass. And you need to have earned benefit of the doubt in those relationships prior to that moment, right? We talk about this all the time, even in regards to preparedness for incident response, right? You have a number of stakeholders who are going to watch you like pound sand, over something that you may or may not have been able to prevent, right? And if you want benefit of the doubt from them, you have to invest in those relationships in advance. If all they know about you is that you're the one that's causing delays, you're the one that's constantly pushing these patches, and there's no other communication, just be like, hey, sorry, this one is actually an emergency. Could you please do it right away? Or we have to force this one to happen. We're not going to force all of them because we trust you. You're an adult, and do it, before you log off. That would be great. The human interaction of all of these things is so important in order to actually influence and manage the different types of behaviors that impact, a company's level of security, which is not only just how many vulnerabilities are in our environment, but like how quickly can we get our team to mobilize and do things that we need them to do. And if your security team doesn't have the trust of other departments, that's not a resource that you can count on in an emergency, right? And the second thing that I wanted to note was that I wanted to ask you, so when you're talking about the objectives, right, and the fact that like security is not always like P0, right, to use jargon, sorry, Kim. I think that there's also a missed opportunity from a leadership level, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. And Jess, I actually think you will have some really interesting insights on this too. It's such a missed opportunity to deny your team the opportunity for creative problem solving by giving them problems that have constraints, right? To say, this is the business objective. I realize it sounds crazy from a security perspective, but you know this space, you know this domain, this is your expertise, this is what you contribute to our team is your opinion and experience on this issue. If we can't get to 100% from a security perspective, what is your recommendation, or what is the architecture, or what can we do to at least minimize the impact of not being 100% on this issue, right? And I think that's where a lot of not just career development and excitement and engagement from an individual team member perspective comes from, but it's also where a lot of our innovation comes from. A lot of security innovation has come from the fact that the business has been constantly pushing the envelope.
Yeah. And I think that, Jess, go ahead.
Go ahead. You start, Josh, and
Okay.
I'll tack on.
I can't agree more. But so what I'm going to share is just some examples of how we've tried imperfectly, but I think I was quite pleased with the results previously. So we're most recently coming out of Jess, Kim, and I, that is, out of Tessian, which is a email security solution. And as a B2B SaaS product, one of the trust requirements that we had was, having our clients be willing to let us read and manipulate email data, which is some of the most critical data that any organization has. So that bar for trust was very, very high compared to a lot of other B2B SaaS applications. And so one of the ways in which we communicated these outcomes and objectives was to really tie this concept of trust back to the business. So one of the outcomes we had was that we build and operate a trustworthy product. Simple. Nobody in any organization that builds any product or offers any service should ever disagree with that, right? If you're in the business of building a product or offering a service and you don't think it should be trustworthy, I can't help you. But it's a messaging that people can get behind, and most importantly, like relatively objectively, people will know when we're not behaving appropriately to actually deliver that towards that outcome. Even better, as engineers or product managers or somebody in finance or HR or anywhere else in the organization thinks about their role, their objectives, and what they're doing, on a regular basis, it doesn't need to be a security team saying, hey, these are the requirements and outcomes and objectives that we are prescribing for you. If you have outcome-oriented language like that, that's actually tied to concepts like trust, there's an organic distribution of alignment where people say, oh, I know how my role in finance maps to this concept of being trustworthy for our customers. For example, I'm on the front lines of wire transfers with vendors, and it's a really bad day if we have wire fraud and I approve something that drains our bank account, or it leads to some other catastrophic calamity for our customers. And so I think that type of structured language and really thinking about how you align a outcome statement like that to the needs of the business, if you can get that right, you actually get this self-perpetuating cycle of people looking at that saying, oh, easy to understand, well communicated, directly aligned with the business outcome that I understand. We count on trust to maintain and grow our revenue. And as we add new product features, it's better to that provides some of the best distributed and shared accountability outcomes that I've ever seen. We failed at many others. It took a long time to get there, but that's like one of my favorite examples.
I love that. And what I would add too is I think, coming back to, setting really clear objectives around that trust concept. I think the other aspect of this for security teams is that sometimes as an individual, it can be really hard to figure out how your day-to-day actually ties back to that. So I think the other thing that's really important is to give your team, your security team, anchors to root themselves in, such as empathy, we've talked a lot about. And I think things like, one of the values, you call them anchors, but also values that we really centralize in is, being kinder than necessary. Early in my career, one of my first jobs was a receptionist. I had no idea where I was going to go, but it was every day was an opportunity for me to see hundreds of people walking through the door. And each one of those interactions was an opportunity for me to make an impression. And I think security teams have that opportunity too. It doesn't mean you have to know the answer to the question. It doesn't mean that you have to, give the perfect answer or direction, but you do have an opportunity for every person you come across to show that you as a security person in your organization care and have curiosity and can empathize with other groups' priorities. And so it gives you a position to make those impressions, but also over time build that capital and figure out how you can help others be rock stars in the org on behalf of the security outcomes that you are hoping to see become true, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, and I'm not saying that anyone has to be 100%, like nobody has ever accused me of having a bubbly personality. Okay. So I'm not suggesting that everybody always has to, have this facade. We all have good days and bad days, right? But if you are routinely somebody who makes people feel negative emotions when they interact with you, they will just naturally cut down the number of interactions that they have. And as a security team, that actually can create more risk for the organization. I think we've all seen that meme. There's different variations of it, of like, here's what the security team wants you to do. And it's all these like roundabout paths and like the easy ways to just go around it, right? Sometimes the security team is the obstacle in the middle, right? From a human level, sometimes it's us as people who are just unbearable or difficult in our interactions, right? And again, this is where like having the trusted relationships and having built benefit of the doubt is important. Like we all have friends and family that we love deeply who, we're all human. We're in a bad mood sometimes, right? So, but if my partner or my best friend like is having an off day, it doesn't rock our relationship. But if somebody who I don't know as well is treating me poorly or is short with me or has a sharp tongue, I'm definitely less likely to try that interaction again, right? And so I think that expectation of being kinder than necessary, I think is important. It's something that in my work with the three of you, like, I really truly believe that the reason the organization was as functioning as it was, despite the challenges that we were working through, was because everybody came to the table with that sentiment of I'm being kinder than necessary. And everybody knew that everybody else was doing it, right? And so it created a lot of this assume good intent kind of psychological safety, where it wasn't just that I'm coming to the table and giving you grace, but I knew that you were doing it for me too, right? Because everybody was on the same page that this is important. It's how we progress as a team. And so I do think it's important that we as individuals don't make ourselves the obstacle for security. It's not just technical challenges, and it's not just oh, there's a new process that you have to go through. Sometimes it's us. Like when people say that humans are the weakest link in security, I'm pointing my finger at the actual security team. I'm like, yeah, it's these humans. It's not the users, it's these humans, right? Like it's our job to not only be welcoming for the people who we're trying to influence and who we're trying to help and who we're trying to persuade. But it's also our job to recognize and to learn how everybody's doing their job, what their goals are, so that we can put appropriate safety nets, right? You know what boards and C-suites really love? Contingency plans. When you go in, you've partnered with the product team, you've partnered with the engineering team, whoever it is, you go in there as a coalition and you say, this is our joint recommendation. It does not hit our top recommendations for security. We're at maybe 85% of what we would want to see from a security perspective. But because we know the business has a goal, here's what we're going to do to minimize the impact if things go wrong, right? Leaders want to see that you have thought through the consequences, that you're not just in there as a zealot, like arguing for your opinion, but that you're thinking about the future and protecting, you know, the integrity and the trust of the organization.
I just want to hop in quick with a little reassurance to folks where I hear a lot that, oh, well, Kim, you would say that because you like talking to people, or, oh, you just have that, you know, like you just enjoy communicating. And the thing is, I actually used to not. And so I just want to step in for the folks who think that they are terrible communicators, who have no social skills and are terrible with people, and say, no, these are learnable skills. I know because I learned them. And it will always be awkward. It will always be, you know, like you can't get things 100% right, but they literally are teachable. And just like a really quick side plug, like that's literally what Melanie does. So, you know, you can learn these things. And it really starts with just how do you make friends, right? Like I think most folks like know interactions that they enjoy. When I think of these trusted relationships, I frequently end up thinking about doctors, just because security folks don't necessarily get a lot of time with people. They may only be talking shop with folks. So like, you know, how do you get to these trusted points when you don't have, you know, you can't talk about your cat all day or something like that, like something that's like a more human personal thing. But doctors have to build this trust and rapport too. We all know that not all doctors are great at this, and we all know how that makes us feel. We also know when doctors are and how grateful we are when they make a family member feel better when they're at their most vulnerable state. And that brings me to something that I think a lot of security folks need to honor, is how vulnerable people feel when they're talking to us. We're frequently seeing them on their worst day. We're seeing them when they know they've made a mistake or they know their team's made a mistake. We're seeing them when we're telling them to do something, implying that they've made a mistake, even if they haven't. And so that kind of vulnerability, that already feels icky. And so you have to have a trusted relationship with someone to be able to show yourself as that kind of vulnerable and not be afraid of them, not feel defensive before them. And so security folks really need to kind of honor that, honestly, like honor that vulnerability that people come to us with.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything to add on that point, Josh or Jess?
I think on my end, I would just really reinforce that, like what Kim just said. This is regardless of how you see yourself in your role and your social inclinations, whatever they are. What I would say is that like all humans tend to have some areas of higher capability for networking within a organizational context. And that doesn't always mean like, you know, grabbing coffee, you know, breaks with people or sitting with them, you know, and grabbing lunch or co-working next to each other. It can be as simple as like lurking in a Slack channel. It can be as simple as contributing to that long neglected wiki page and then driving engagement within the organization and then building relationships that way. It's like literally just participating in the way that is most comfortable to you can turn into and should turn into that opportunity. And I want to call out like a superpower because that's one that Kim has, by the way. I've seen her like actually apply in many different organizations at this point of just figuring all the right places to go to gain like just good situational awareness. And I think that that's something that like I've learned like through working with Kim to actually look for in others to actually figure out, okay, cool, how do I, as a like a people manager and somebody accountable for teams, like how do I find that earlier and like tap into it, so it's like it's something that I can actually encourage, and then also, you know, help folks understand how to actually apply in terms of building those relationships, earning the political capital, so that yeah, you can then go and be awesome together through that relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good way for, I think sometimes we forget as an industry or as a profession perhaps, that you can have a lot of like informal influence and authority in your organization, but it's not going to happen if you work in isolation. And so, you know, while I wish every engineering organization had like triaging security tickets as a requirement to go from an L4 to an L5, that's just not always possible, right? Or at least maybe not at the moment. And, you know, one of the things that I'm constantly telling clients is we don't really need to convert everybody to our religion of security, right? Everybody's has their own priorities and they're incentivized by different things for a good reason, right? If there's no business, there's no need for a security team. And so I'm not trying to convince people to care about security for the same reasons that I care about security. I just need to get them into the church. And if the only reason they're there is for the potluck dinner, then fine, right? People show up for their own reasons. People participate for their own reasons. And I think that's really where like a true shared, I don't want to say responsibility, but accountability. I think that's the word that you've been using, Josh, that I really like. That true shared accountability comes from like, what was our goal? Our goal was not religious conversion. Our goal was safer outcomes, smarter choices, closer alignment. You can see how you can shape KPIs and other performance metrics based on, I'm not just trying to make sure that there's zero vulnerabilities in our product. Like that's not even an achievable thing, even if shared responsibility did exist. But what I want is I want to have a relationship with the engineering team and the service owners so that when we have a serious issue, I don't look like the boy who cried wolf because I made every previous issue feel like the end of the world, right? And because they know that I would only be asking this if it really was important. And on other things, I have compromised so that they could get a win, right? And then I'm doing my best as either a partner or a project lead to make sure those people are getting credit for the work that they have done to contribute to my outcomes, right? Sending emails or Slack messages, whatever the communication channel is for your team, like send it to their skip level, copy their manager, make your project and the engagement with you, something that they want to put in their performance package. All right. And Jessica has acutely reminded me that we have 1 minute left. Which is definitely not the time that I have written down here in my notebook. So I don't know if I'm in a different time zone than I was yesterday. But I just want to close with any final thoughts from your team in terms of what do you want to leave people with in regards to having actual shared accountability?
I think that it's again about finding those anchors and values in your team and bringing that to the rest of the organization in all those touch points that you have. No matter how small or big, it's such an important opportunity to build that trust with everyone. And so just keep that in mind for every one of those moments.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thanks everybody for joining. This is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it later on the YouTube channel, and please share it with friends and colleagues. And please reach out to me or to any of the amazing folks at Credible Security if you would like help actually building these programs and implementing them for your security team.
Thanks, everyone.
Josh, Kim, Jessica, Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, we are now shut down.
Jessica, for real, I was
Awesome.
going till 12:40. Like that's what I wrote down. I was
Oh,
like,
I think,
It was 'cause-
I think